Okay, we're going to have our first performance right now by Professor Richard Alston. He's a native of East Orange, New Jersey. Richard Alston is a masterful pianist, having appeared as a soloist in recitals with orchestras throughout the United States and Europe. He received his Bachelor of Music degree from the Juilliard of Music in New York City, where he studied with Erwin Frunlich and Joseph Raef. He was later awarded the highly prestigious Maria Guerrera Jodelson Scholarship in Piano, and returned to Juilliard for his master's degree as well. Under the direction of Professor Alston, a respectable associate degree music program at Essex County College in New Jersey has flourished into a full-fledged performing arts department of music, dance, and drama. Professor Alston is a recipient of several awards, among them the Award for Excellence from the New Jersey Education Association, the Community Leaders Fostering Change in Education Award from the New Jersey Unit of the National Association of Negro Business and Women's Clubs, and Musician of the Year by the National Association of Negro Musicians Incorporated, Newark, New Jersey chapter. Professor Alston is currently the host and producer of the cable television show Performing Arts Showcase at Essex County College. The show features instrumentalists and vocalists from New York/New Jersey metropolitan area. So please welcome Professor Alston as he performs Classically Black.
Before I begin, I want to ask you to do a favor for me, and would you please silence all cell phones for me? I'd appreciate that. I want to thank my colleagues for presenting this conference. I especially want to thank Professor Rebecca Williams for inviting me to perform Classically Black here at Essex County College. I performed this at several universities and colleges throughout the country, and it really feels good to bring it home. I want to share with you the inspiration behind this lecture concert. I play music by Chopin, by Liszt, Schumann, Bach, and so this concert lecture is highlighting composers of African descent. This needs to be done because most people, when you think of music performed by African Americans and written by African Americans, you think about R&B, you think about jazz, you think about gospel music, but classical African American or composers of African descent go way back to the time of Mozart. Now, my first introduction to music like this began when I was about 8 years old. I studied with a local piano teacher in East Orange, New Jersey. I don't know if any of you are studying piano, but there's a series called the John Thompson Piano Method. And in book 2 of John Thompson's Piano Method, there is this selection. That selection is called Carry Me Back to Old Virginia. But what's important about that is when I was given this piece to learn as an 8-year-old, I was already playing Bach minuets, Clementi sonatinas, and when my teacher assigned this piece, she said, "This is by a black man." James Bland wrote Carry Me Back to Old Virginia. When I do this concert around the country, I usually ask the audience, do they know who wrote it? And everybody says Stephen Foster. Stephen Foster did not write this. So what's important was alongside of my music by Bach, by Mozart, by Chopin, here was a composition by a composer that looked like me. And I encourage students, whenever I meet them and do the lecture, to know the music of your people. If you're Latino, you should not just know the pop composers and singers that are Latino, but you should know all you can. So that was the first inspiration. The second inspiration came when I got my first teaching position down the street at Rutgers University right here in Newark. I was teaching music appreciation. And every now and then when I taught music appreciation, I might play something by Scott Joplin, or I might mention the name Duke Ellington, and people looked at me like, who's that? And so I was asked by the chairperson, could I design a course for Rutgers that would showcase, highlight composers of African descent that composed classical music. Back then, the music appreciation books were not including anything by a composer that was of African descent. Now, years later, things have changed. So I created that course for Rutgers. When I came here at Essex, I was very happy to see that there was a course offered called Black Contributions in Music. Now, what's interesting about this course, it's offered even this semester, and I think it'll be offered in the fall, is that we have 6 or more sections of Music 100. The music of Bach, the music of Mozart, 6 sections with 30 students in each section. The Black contribution, 1 section, maybe 15 students, maybe. This also fulfills the humanities requirement. So what I do is I'm encouraging you is I have nothing against Mozart and Bach and Beethoven. I play them. But if you're of African descent, you really should discover what were the origins of the spiritual. How did gospel come to be? All right? What classical composers are there in addition to what I'm going to speak today? And there's a book in the bookstore I recommend you to get called The Music of Black Americans by Eileen Southern, because she covers everything in this book from African music to African instruments to spirituals to gospel music to jazz to Black Broadway shows. So I can't do this lecture. I have to stay within a certain amount of time, but I encourage you to get that book downstairs. The first selection I want to perform for you is a piano transcription of the spiritual Wade in the Water. I first was introduced to this piece when I heard another pianist play it. And I heard this other pianist play it. She played it very, very well, but I had to play it. It really got to me. And I also felt that there was more to the music than she was bringing out when she played it. So I learned it. The title of the piece is called Troubled Waters. Now, singers have lyrics to help you interpret the song, to help you bring the song across. Instrumentalists like myself, pianists, we don't have lyrics. But there are words to this spiritual. Now, many of you know of the spiritual Wade in the Water as being sung during the baptism in a church service. But I was trying to understand why Margaret Bond did not call it transcription on Wade in the Water. Why she called it Troubled Waters. Now, what I'm about to tell you is my interpretation. This is how I came to understand why she calls it Troubled Water. Many spirituals had a double meaning. They had the obvious meaning that the master of the plantation knew, in this case, the Wade in the Water, baptized. But then there was a coded meaning. And the coded meaning, only the slaves knew. And so this coded meaning meant if you were a slave and you were going to try to seek freedom, to escape the plantation, at some point in your journey, you must get into the water. Why? Because dogs were going to be sent to track you down. If you got into the water, the dogs would lose the scent, and they couldn't find you. So I felt this. Once that slave got into the water, all of the trials, tribulations, all the hardships, all the violence they had to endure got into that water with them. And so even if that water was as calm as could be before they got in, once they got in, that water was changed and became troubled. Even though this conference is modernism, I'm going to take you back. There was a composer by the name of Chevalier de Saint-Georges. He was a Frenchman, and he didn't start off as a composer. He actually started off as a world-class fencer. His mother was from Africa, but his father was the governor of the island. He was a white man. So he was a mulatto, Chevalier de Saint-Georges, but he was dark complexion, so everybody knew that this man had African heritage, African blood in him. And he composed symphonies, he composed concertos, he lived in the time of Mozart, and some even speculate that Mozart did meet him, even though Mozart was much younger than him. But he even later ran an opera company that was to become the Paris Opera. And here is a piece that he wrote, originally for the harpsichord. I'm going to play on the piano, naturally, but it's called Adagio in F minor. The word adagio is an Italian term that refers to playing the music very calmly and very slowly. There was a movie, I'm a big movie buff, I want to thank my students for coming this morning. There was a movie called Rain Man. And Rain Man was about an individual, a man, who was a savant. A savant is a person that even though they may have learning difficulties or comprehension difficulties of some things, they possess a talent or a skill that overshadows that. For example, my mother was a nurse, and she spoke about, or told me about, that there was a patient in this hospital, and he would spend a lot of time drawing. And they didn't think much of it until one day they noticed him looking out the window, and he was drawing the building that was across from the building he was in. There was one thing about his drawing, though. He was drawing this brick building brick by brick. So here we have a composer, Blind Tom, who any music he heard, he could play it on the piano. The master of the plantation allowed him to come into the big house, so to speak, and he played the piano there. And anything he heard, he could play it. He was so magnificent at this that people wanted to hear him. So the master of the plantation took him not just across that southern state or several southern states, he took him all across the country, even to the White House. Blind Tom performed. When there was the Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves, the master of the plantation decided he asked Blind Tom's parents for custody. And they signed over custody to him, thus allowing him to continue to take Blind Tom all throughout the country here and make money off of Blind Tom. Here is Blind Tom's Waltz Bassa Tuba. Another movie, The Entertainer. I don't know if any of you remember that. Not The Entertainer. That was the song that became famous from that. What was the movie? Now all of a sudden the name escapes me. The Sting. Thank you. Thank you. This next composer became famous because of The Sting, that movie. In The Sting, they played this piece. That is. Scott Joplin wrote many compositions that are called rags. And I sent out to my colleagues here at Essex County College a little quiz. And in the quiz, I asked them, do they know why it is called a rag? And someone wrote me back and said, oh, because it's ragtime. It was played in ragtime. Well, no, ragtime would not exist if there weren't rags. So it's called a rag because the piece uses what is called syncopation. Syncopation, I'm not going to ask my music students to define it. I'm going to just tell. Syncopation is when you accent a beat that is normally not accented. If we take the time of 4/4 or the meter of 4, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. But if I take that first accent and put it on 2, 3, or 4 like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, then it becomes syncopated. Syncopation is when you take the accent and put it on a beat that is normally not accented. So when Scott Joplin wrote his rags, they were called that because people felt the rhythm became ragged. And that is why this piece is called the Maple Leaf Rag. A number of years ago, I met a woman. She was doing a lecture about her father. Her father was the composer William Grant Still, who's referred to as the dean of African American composers. And she was telling stories about him and his life of composing music. And he wrote symphonies, he wrote compositions for piano, but he was not accepted by the other major classical composers of the time who were European. And this went as far as, she told the story, that there was going to be this portrait done, and it was going to feature some of the great composers, classical composers of his time, Igor Stravinsky, Aaron Copland, to name a few. And what happened was these composers schemed and decided that they were going to stand in front of him so that he would not really be seen in the portrait. And so what happened, great composer Igor Stravinsky was not going to go along with this. And he was very, very highly regarded. Stravinsky wrote a wonderful piece called The Rite of Spring. And so what Stravinsky did was, when it became time, I say portrait, not a painting, but a photo. When it became time for the photo to be taken, moments before it was taken, Stravinsky took William Grant Still by the arm and pulled him next to him in front of the other composers. And that is why William Grant Still's picture is included, and he's not behind. This is the final movement from a suite he wrote called A Deserted Plantation. Next, there's an English composer, Samuel Coleridge-Taylor. He actually was very influential to the Czech composer Dvorak. And Dvorak wrote a wonderful symphony called the New World Symphony, and in the movement, third movement of that, he actually includes a spiritual. But Samuel Coleridge-Taylor came to this country, was very, very highly regarded. And this is the last movement of his suite called Petite Suite de Concert. I have a question for you. Who wrote the song Take the A Train? Anybody out there know? Who said that? You gave it away. Most people say Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington and his band, his orchestra, made the song famous, but it was actually composed by a man named Billy Strayhorn. That's who wrote Take the A Train. Let me tell you a little bit about Billy Strayhorn. Billy Strayhorn loved the piano. His first dream was to become a concert pianist. When he was in high school, they had musicals. Billy Strayhorn wrote all the music for these musicals. And when he was 15, he wrote this composition that I'm going to play for you now called Valse. But before I play Valse, I want to tell you something about Take the A Train. When he was to meet Duke Ellington for the first time, he called Duke Ellington and said, okay, how do I get to you? How do I come to your place? And Duke Ellington said, take the A Train. He wrote this composition, Take the A Train, yet he felt it wasn't that great of a piece of music. So he actually threw it away. A friend of his took it out of the trash and said, no, I believe this is a great piece of music. And so, no, you're not going to throw it away. And so as history is, or went, he did take it to Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington loved it. And I think that's one of Duke Ellington's compositions that he's most known for. This is a valse that Billy Strayhorn wrote when he was 15 years old. The first composition I played for you, Troubled Waters, has a lot in common with this composition. First of all, my music theory students should note that the first composition was in the key of E minor, and so is this in the key of E minor. The first composition was based upon a spiritual wade in the water. This composition is based upon the spiritual sinner. Please don't let this harvest pass. And the final thing they have in common is Margaret Bonds was the star pupil of Florence Price. This is Florence Price's Fantasy Negra. For my final composition, I want to play a composition that's not listed on the program. This piece is based upon a gospel song, and it's written in a very virtuoso classical style. The composer is a man named Andre Crouch. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but this composition is based upon his song titled My Tribute. I want to thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoyed this. I thank you for coming today. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Alston. Again,